Okay. So, thank you for joining us today for this workshop, Physical and Emotional Hoarding, the same movie, different formats, presented by Daniel Dashnaw, family and marriage therapist, and sponsored by Elder Care Work Life at the University of Kentucky. Daniel, would you like to introduce yourself and get started?
Yes, thank you, Hazel. My name is Daniel Dashnaw. I'm a marriage and family therapist. I have a private practice. My website's daniel-couples-therapy.com, and I have a blog there. And a while back, I did a blog on emotional hoarding, and Hazel happened to have read it, and she reached out to me and told me about the UK community and some of her concerns about an interest in physical versus emotional hoarding. And I remember saying to me, I got no budget, but I'd love to have you help. And I said, well, definitely I'll do it. And the reason why was in a clinic I work in, I work with a hoarder who's 75 years old, and he was able to teach me a great deal about the emotional side of this. And my supervisor at the clinic I work in, her mother was a hoarder, and she was able to also help me understand a lot about the emotional content. So the slideshow I'm doing starts out with a general discussion of American culture and notions of hoarding, both physical and emotional. But then I'll be segueing into more of Kentucky culture around the notion of hoarding and some of the ideas that you might be dealing with more locally. Um, so let's start the slides. So, one of the things I was talking to Hazel about before we started was the notion of self storage facilities. They're full of items that we want, but we don't need to live next to on a daily basis. So the notion of 49,000 self-storage facilities is pretty amazing. Um, we now know from research that the prevalence of hoarding is a little over 6% in seniors, but it's like a third of that in younger adults. And the Senate Committee on Aging called hoarding a quiet but persistent public health crisis. Next. So, why is that? Why are older Americans so prone to emotional and physical hoarding? Well, part of it's the narrative of the period of American history they lived in. They lived in many cases through the Great Depression, perhaps through rationing through the Second World War. They lived through inflations. American culture as a mantra of being frugal. Um, and the problem with frugality is when it meets Amazon Prime, it results in a lot of clutter and pressure to downsize as a national issue. What's interesting about American hoarding is the stigma. Americans are really harsh on hoarders. We look at hoarding with a very jaundiced eye, much more so than anxiety or OCD or depression. We really are very judgy as a culture about hoarders. As a result, families that deal with hoarding often report secrecy, shame. Sometimes the problem has got to the point where they've been threatened with eviction. The end result is because of the notion of American culture's attitude towards physical hoarding, there's more shame, more isolation, and yeah, more hoarding. So let's talk about the difference between physical versus emotional hoarding. Now, we can think about the physical in terms of collectibles or coupons or newspapers. Uh, uh, um, what's interesting about physical collections of things is they're usually an expression of ourselves or a part of ourselves uh, um, trying to sort of like reclaim a part of ourselves. It's not unusual for people to collect things that relate to their childhood or some part of their life in some way. My hoarder in my clinic had boxes and boxes and boxes of old church bulletins, which were utterly, completely useless. They had no reading value or any value whatsoever, which allows it to conform to what we normally think of hoarding, which is holding on to newspapers or magazines that are utterly, completely useless. But emotional hoarding is a different thing. Emotional hoarding is remorse, regret, grief, a sense of being incomplete or having unfinished projects. Um, the issue with either type of these hoarding dynamics is to invite change, is to spike your heart rate and invite cortisol uh, and a lot of apprehension. Uh, People do not like giving up their resentments, and they don't like giving up their old magazines either. Next. So, from a public health perspective, um, hoarding is dangerous. It increases the likelihood of injury by 60%. It doubles the risk of fire deaths. And there's an unhealthy loop of loneliness, uh, um, reducing the size of and frequency of human contact, and sometimes that translates into bringing in yet more objects into the home. Next. So I know this is kind of wonky here, but neuroscience is informing therapy at an amazing rate. And we now do fMRIs with folks, and we can see that when it comes to hoarders, we've got a low interior cingulate, which means they're not realizing that this is problematic. And at the same time, we got a high insula activity, which means they can see this is very emotionally important to them. It's salient. So the problem is they feel an urge to make a decision, but at the same time, they find it impossible to do so. They're frozen. Now, what do you do if a loved one is frozen? Well, try to recognize that our cultural attitudes toward hoarding are really kind of unkind. So join before you judge. Shrink the battlefield. Try not to talk about everything, but talk about like what's in front of you right now. Um, think about not only your future self, but your family member's future self. One of the things that hoarding doesn't do is hoarding does not anticipate death. In fact, hoarding, I think, in some respects, and I had an interesting conversation with a supervisor about this, talking about her mother who was a hoarder, was she thought that one of the reasons her mother hoarded was to cheat death in some way. Uh, and the idea that she would have to go through a systematic decluttering of worthless hoarded items and then a systematic review of things that were significant and pregnant with meaning uh, resulted in her having to confront her own mortality, which she just didn't want to do. So the notion of a future self also involves, well, what do we do with this shit when you're gone? How can you help us with this? Offer clear choices. Speaking from the heart about going through items involves understanding, what are we going to do with this? We can do this or we could do that. What do you think? And because this is emotionally exhausting and highly draining, when you're going through items with your loved one, take breaks from time to time. Let them tell stories. Next. Now, for a conventional best practice, if you're going to hire a mental health practitioner to work with a hoarder, they'll say, yes, we're going to need 16 sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy. They might do it in the house. They might bring on a skills coach. They might recommend medication as well. But the whole notion of what we're trying to do, we're trying to retrain their brain and we're trying to make them aware of the actual ongoing safety issues because of the amount of stuff that's in their house. Next. So I do a lot of work with clinicians as well around this and other issues. And what I say to them is, if you think you're dealing with a hoarding situation, make sure you know what you're not dealing with first. You should be ruling out wholesale dementia or psychosis. You should basically understand that, there are certain ways of talking that might require you to listen a little bit more intently to what they're saying. There are screenings that can be done as well by licensed professionals. And we also have to understand, what the setting is going to be. You don't do the same way you would engage in a home versus a clinic setting if you have a crisis. And also, it's very often a situation where you need a team approach. And you need a multi-layered approach. You might need some work in the home. You might need some work outside the home. You might need medication. You might need family therapy. There's any number of ways of doing it, but when you're engaging with somebody who's emotionally or physically hoarding, and uh, it's a problem for the family, it's not a one-off where one person comes to the rescue and solves the problem. It's always going to be uh, a complex approach. Next. Now, one of the ways that I like to work with this is group therapy. And I don't know if at the UK community this is something that you could possibly do, but I've developed a few interventions around hoarding that are in a group therapy sort of setting. It's been reported that when you do group work, you can get as much as a 35% reduction in ongoing clutter. And also, the ongoing homework adherence tends to improve when they're in an ongoing group, helping them to engage with their hoarding. And you could do groups virtually as well as in person. Um, obviously, the ideal is be able to have a group where the members of the group have the emotional resilience to be able to engage in feedback and to be able to accept feedback. Now, earlier I talked about how my supervisor told me that she felt that, at least where her mother was concerned, that her hoarding was an antidote against death. Well, in Sweden, they have this thing called death cleaning. In that culture, they accept death as a reality, and they expect older folks to clean up their houses in anticipation of death. Uh, an interesting metaphor for this is kintsugi, which is a metaphor for healing. Kintsugi is an art form in Japan where you have a broken ceramic bowl and you repair it with melted gold or melted platinum or melted silver. And so you have a repaired bowl with the repair seam obvious in a precious metal, but it's restored the bowl to wholeness with the scar visible. But the scar is precious. It's a wonderful metaphor, and it has applications, I think, in American culture when we talk about emotional meaning behind objects. Um, there are some cultures in the United States and across the world that have an ongoing problem with hoarding. Latino families often do because of their value of the family system um, and the emotional intensity that they bring to history and family history. It complicates the ability to downsize for many Latino families. Um, Another compensatory factor is when community rituals can come up to enhance, restore, and remind of community memory, to keep emotional memory in a community alive so that individual families don't feel responsible to do so themselves. So when it comes to American culture, it's really a situation where if you're going to declutter, there has to be a meaning made of that activity. That meaning is always going to be culturally bound. In Sweden, when an old person cleans out their house, it's named and thought of in terms of, this is an anticipation of my not being around. This is an act of love towards my family to make cleaning up the remnants of my existence that much easier for them to do. They literally call it death cleaning. At the same time, these objects that you have too many of, some of them hold powerful emotions, fears, hopes, memories. And those are obviously separate and apart from objects that have no such cultural value, that more resemble things that no one thinks you should keep. So there's a parsing effect in American culture where we're separating the memorable from the trivial. One of the problems of American shame about hoarding is the sense of ridicule that we sometimes bring to it. And actually, the best way to approach this issue is with a sense of the sacred, and to try to separate the sacred from the material. What's important to keep, and why is it important? What are the narratives behind that? Can you tell me the story behind this? It's very therapeutic for hoarders to be able to tell stories. My client Ed would get extremely emotional and tearful in session when I would ask him to describe the emotional significance of an item that he decided to keep. And I realized that for folks like Ed, the decision to keep something is a profound experience. Those were the references I had from that part of the session. So I wanted to talk also about Kentucky and nearby communities, and talk about, Kentucky as perhaps a separate cultural lens. Next. And the first thing I was thinking about was the famous Southern author William Faulkner, who once said, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." Folks in Kentucky are skilled at holding on to things and to feelings. On good days, this is an instinct that preserves heritage. On harder days, it might tend to approach hoarding. So let's talk about hoarding from a clinical perspective for a while. What is it? Well, it's more than just clutter. It becomes clinical when letting go triggers distress or panic. And I certainly saw that with my client, Ed. Now, both physical and emotional hoarding cause real abiding suffering. Physical hoarding, unsafe clutter, you're looking at anywhere from 2 to 6% of Americans engage in this activity, which is a pretty huge number. But I don't think we have numbers on emotional hoarding. I just don't think that we do. Regrets, grudges, unspoken grief. The reason why we talk about these things together clinically is because they both involve the same exact circuitry in the brain, the insula and the anterior cingulate. So let's talk just about Kentucky. Well, Kentucky is unusual in that it is a huge number of storage spaces. Barns, lofts, what have you, over 52,000 plus 300 US storage units. Lots of them are in Kentucky. There's a mindset here of consumer abundance, and the shopping online has made acquiring new items seamless and painless. You no longer have to go out to get things. Things can come to you. Uh, they can be physical, they can be photos, they can be emails, they can be digital, but we've got more and more things coming at us all the time. And as my generation, the baby boomers, have aged, their sentimental attachments have merely deepened over time. Uh, and as a result of that, we have an Appalachian testimony culture. Oral stories, I would like to suggest, are another form of storage. Next. So I want to talk a little bit about testimony culture in Kentucky, which I found kind of interesting. And I was thinking that it might be seen as a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, there's a sense of abiding preservation, keeping history alive, and that can transform historical pain into resilience. But also, testimony culture is also perpetuation of silence around scandals or grief or accumulating unprocessed hurt. Um, I always found myself really interested about the notion of testimony being a release valve in the community for emotional hoarding. So these are just a few ideas I had about. Now, a therapeutic approach isn't something like a therapist necessarily does. A therapeutic approach is anything that helps. A family could have a therapeutic approach. A community could have a therapeutic approach. So the notion of clutter and thrift, carrying love, not pathology, is a way of challenging that hostile notion that we have in America about uh, look at all this crap, look at all this junk. So if we bring a sense of the sacred to clutter and we choose to engage with it lovingly and not as a pathology, the individual tools we use for that would be our own curiosity and what I would call sort of legacy ceremonies, which is you could come together at church, you could have grief testimony. This could be done at cooperative extensions. Fire departments could be involved with this. Charities could redistribute excess. In other words, a community could actually get involved as a project, working with not just one home, but perhaps a number of homes in the community that are looking to deal with this dynamic. So one of the things I was thinking about was how do we bring the emotional reality of hoarding into the mindset of a loved one who's concerned about the hoarder, but they themselves are perhaps repelled by it or confused by it. I would say, well, here's some ideas that you might want to think about. Name something you're afraid to lose. Why are you afraid to lose it? What story does that carry? Can you go a while without looking at the internet, without looking at digital stuff? What's it like for you to refrain from some of the habits that you have of the things that you do? Like you may not acquire physical objects, but are you acquiring digital objects? So if you think about your own relationship to the things that come into your life that you don't let go, maybe you'll be a little bit more curious uh, in how you deal with your loved one. And to keep it really simple, hoarding is not about an aesthetic. It's not about this house is a mess. Hoarding isn't about can't you get off your butt and clean this place? It's not about laziness. Hoarding is about safety, first and foremost. So, Kentucky folks know that the land remembers. but they also know that hauling yesterday and today has a cost. Whether clutter is in an attic or whether it's in your heart, the question remains, will this make me whole? Or is holding on to it keeping me from a sense of wholeness? So I'm saying, when we bear testimony, whether we're in therapy or whether we're in church or whether we're speaking in a community setting, we could turn these memories that are kind of static into a more living wisdom as we engage with the folks in our community that are hoarding. Be well, stay kind, Godspeed. I'm ready for any questions you might have now.